Welcome to the Casting Across Fly Fishing Podcast. I'm Matthew of castingacross.com, where I explore the quarry and culture of fly fishing. Episode 356 of the podcast, and we are talking about getting that fly down. As you are probably well aware, the majority of foodstuffs that trout in particular consume are under the surface. And so although we have this beautiful bucolic image of a little mayfly floating its way downstream, and then you have the nice gentle rise and that perfect picture of a trout being hooked and being fought and all those things that are great, and we want those. Most of what fish eat are bouncing along the bottom in a much more haphazard and less beautiful manner. And so if we can imitate those insects, those fish, those crayfish, whatever they may be, then you're going to catch more fish. And so we're talking about getting those flies down today. Because as you are probably also well aware, it's not as easy as just tying a nymph on and throwing it in. For new anglers in particular, subsurface fly fishing can be pretty intimidating. Now, the strike indicators are incredibly helpful. Tight line nymphing techniques, which have certainly become quite popular in the last decade, is also very, very helpful. But what the thing that I want to focus on today is how do you get that fly down? Because this is a true challenge in certain situations. So I'll start with an anecdote. One of my most frustrating early angling memories was on a tumbling mountain stream in the Catoctin Mountains of Maryland. And I had hiked up for quite a ways, and I came across a pool, and it was just a picturesque pool, but there was no fish rising. It was a very, very cloudy day. It was starting to get chilly. There was very little insect activity, but there was a number of fish that could be seen feeding at the very head of the pool. But it was a plunge pool, and the waterfall into the pool was causing a pretty deep depression on the front or the head of that pool, which meant that the fish were sitting in a place where they could feed on all of those insects and other things that were coming over the waterfall and then being pushed down through the length of that pool. And so, effectively, the fish at the head of the pool were the deepest fish, and they were probably 3 or 4 feet down. Well, this is not that big of a problem, except in this situation, they are 3 feet down and only about a foot away from that waterfall. And so you had a few options. One was to cast into the waterfall, which shot your fly down, and you completely lose sight of it. And also, what you were observing when you watched that fly get pushed down in that waterfall is that it usually came out underneath those fish, which, from a presentation standpoint, was problematic because the line from your leader would now be running across those fish. There's really no good way to get that fly down in that waterfall and then also pop up into the feeding column of those particular fish. But if you cast just nearer to yourself, nearer to those fish from that waterfall, there wasn't enough time to get that fly down. And so I remember resorting to a number of different tactics, trying to cast to the front of the waterfall and putting more weight on and just trying to figure it out. And it just took me hours to try to get this fly in front of the fish. And every once in a while, enough of the variables would come together where that fly would pass in front of those fish and they would move their head a little bit to one side or another, maybe even take a swipe at it. But as often is the case with situations like this, after you have been just so intensely focused on getting the fly where you need to be for a long period of time, you're actually not even thinking about setting the hook. And so I don't think I had a lot of success that day. But there's been other situations, other circumstances, other angling problem-solving moments that I've had to address in all of these years of fly fishing. And I would say that getting your fly down is probably one of the things that, although it may be kind of common sense and second nature if you've been fly fishing for a long time, even if you have been fly fishing for a long time, there may be circumstances that require a little bit more thought, a little bit more energy, a little more effort. And so I'm going to talk about 4 things today, actually 5 things today, because the first one I think is the most essential, and one of the things that I don't know if everybody necessarily tends to spend time on, and that is to watch and experiment. So watch and experiment. So what do I mean by that? Well, I like to watch how my fly flows in the water. I think a lot of us do. And so when I am fishing a nymph, whether that be a weightless nymph or whether it be a weighted nymph or whether it be a multi-nymph rig with some sort of other weight like split shot attached to it, I like to cast upstream of myself and watch how that fly looks in the water as it drifts in front of me. So ideally what you have there is you have an identical set of variables that you are putting yourself in that moment that will be the case when you make that presentation. So what do I mean by that? So say you see a lie in front of you that's maybe 15 feet in front of you, where you think there might be a fish, whether you actually have seen the fish and you do some sight fishing, or whether there be some sort of depression in the stream or a boulder or something like that. You have something 15 feet in front of you. So you can, cast maybe 10 feet in front of that. So you've got now a triangle. It is 15 feet, in front of you, 10 feet upstream, and then, a squared plus b squared equals c squared, and you have this angle between yourself and that cast where you made that presentation. Well, what you want to do then is you're going to cast directly upstream from yourself, and you can now watch, as you meant, you can watch that rig or that nymph bounce along the bottom of the stream. Maybe it gets hung up, or maybe it is really, really high up in the water column. If the water's moving very fast, then that nymph is just being swept a few inches under the surface. And now you can make adjustments to make sure that your fly is going to be where you want it to be when you do make that cast upstream, 10 feet from that spot 15 in front of you. It's never going to be perfect, but you want to kind of at least have an idea. So that's kind of the easiest way to watch an experiment when you are trying to gauge the depth of your fly or flies. But something else that you can do is just drop something in the water. Drop a little pebble. Now, again, a pebble is going to have a lot more density than even a really heavily weighted fly, but you're able to kind of gauge of what's happening. If the water's moving really, really fast, how much is that pebble being moved? So a great, analog to this is a few blades of grass when dropped from, shoulder height are going to move very differently in the wind than a golf ball when hit with a driver. However, that kind of that information that you're gauging from what that grass does as you drop it in the air and the wind moves it is going to kind of help you gauge what you need to do when you hit that golf shot. Thus concludes my knowledge about golf. But it illustrates a similar scenario to kind of watching something drift in the water. So this has even happened once I've basically blown up a pool, when I haven't been able to get my presentation right, when I haven't been able to get that fly where it needs to be. And so consequently, I've lined fish or I've spooked fish in some other way. I will go up and I'll, basically drop my fly right in that spot I want to drop it and see what happens, so that the next time I'm there, I can think, okay, here's the issue. There's a current I didn't see. There's a boulder that I didn't see that was causing an interesting flow underneath the surface of the water. It's actually really, really fast here because it's just downstream of something. And I'm able to kind of get a better idea. So the next time I come, I can say, okay, now I need to cast a little bit further upstream, a little further to the side, or one of the things that we'll talk about here momentarily. And so you can do that with your fly. You can do that with, again, some sort of foreign object that you throw in the water from stream side, and just get that idea. And it's really just kind of getting this base level hydrology bank of information. How does water impact stuff? How does water impact the things that are in that water? And yes, your fly is of primary importance. But once you get to know these variables and how they interact with one another, you know about how and why fish go where they go. You understand why streams are formed the way they are. You can understand after a significant weather event why the stream is changing. And again, all of these things do impact your prospecting for fish and impact the presentation of that fly to those fish. So that's the first thing. I would say watch and experiment. So the second thing, and I've alluded to this already, is your fly. Now, I am a big fan of really trying to keep your flies as simple as possible. I don't want to carry, 10 different sizes of hare's ear nymphs with 3 different weights on each of them with other variables. I just don't have enough space in my box to have a full fly box of hare's ears, a full fly box of pheasant tails, a full fly box of copper johns. I have to kind of pick and choose what I think is going to be the best. But, of course, making sure that you have a fly with some weight on it if you're in a fast current, so weight on it if you need to get it down quickly, is really quite important. We'll talk about the equipment you can add to that later on, split shot and things like that. But really, it's very, very beneficial if you can understand how a fly interacts with the water, a particular fly. And so I'll give that good example of a tungsten bead on a hare's ear nymph is going to sink at a slower rate. There's a very good chance of this, especially in slow water, than a copper john with just a normal, slotted bead. And the reason is that hare's ear nymph has got all of those dense fibers in it that are going to hang on to little air bubbles. And so even though the weight may be heavier, it also has more resistance as it is sinking. And so being able to think through things like that, look at your flies, assess them as such, and maybe even if you think that a particular pattern is going to be the better pattern, then if you can't use it effectively, switching to a different pattern that is going to function more effectively in that situation is going to be the thing to do. So know how different flies, different materials, different weights, and even different shapes can impact how your fly is presented. I think a great example of this is, when we look at, again, I'll go back to the well of the hare's ear because it's just a very, very simple fly. I like a big, buggy hare's ear. And the reason for that is because I think that it presents the best likeness of some sort of macroinvertebrate that is wriggling and squiggling. There's more opportunities for there to be stray fibers to which there is motion and to which there are little air bubbles that are attached to it. I think it's a wonderful profile. I don't like those anemic looking hare's ears, the ones that are relatively tightly dubbed, even if they have a nice wing case. But the benefit of those is that you do get something that is imitating an macroinvertebrate of that color and of that profile, and it isn't going to have that same sort of resistance as it is sinking. And so they are kind of ugly, but they do the job. And at the end of the day, what are we doing? We are imitating bugs, right? So it doesn't matter how they look to you and me, it matters how they look to the fish. And so instead of maybe fishing a copper john, something a little bit flashier, something a little bit more unnatural, you can fish something more natural, but with that profile that accomplishes effectively the same thing. This is true of streamers also, but that's kind of another conversation we can have on another day. So the first thing, watch an experiment. Second, make sure you know how your flies work. The third thing is figure out your angles. So we're kind of working backwards here because we're talking about casting next. But really, if you're not in a good angle, then your cast isn't going to matter as much. So figure out where you need to stand to make your presentation. So sometimes this means instead of being comfortable at the back end of a pool or on the edge of a riffle and being able to stand up fully and make that nice quartering away cast and allow that drift to happen, you may have to be on your hands and knees halfway up the riffle, or you may be crouching at the head of the pool. And now this introduces a whole other bevy of dynamics, including fishing from upstream as opposed to downstream, and having to modify the way you set the hook and things like that. But if there is a situation where it comes down to getting your fly in front of the fish or not, it doesn't matter how you're going to set the hook and fight the fish if you can't get that fly in front of the fish. So I like to think about a particular location where I need to get my fly down deep quickly and think, where can I stand such that my cast can be put in the right place so that fly can get down. So if I'm having to cast, again, upstream or even quartering away upstream, is my line going to be laying in the water such that it gets pulled quicker than that fly can descend into the water? Again, we'll talk about casts here in a moment and different casts that you can make and casting techniques that you can employ to mitigate some of those effects. However, I think the important thing to know is that there may be situations where you do need to cast closer upstream to your target than you might like in order to give your fly an opportunity to descend, or simply to avoid certain currents that are going to move that fly in an inappropriate manner. Inappropriate in the sense that it is not going to be able to drop down into that feeding lane, drop down that water column, and then move in front of the fish. So again, I would say experiment. Blowing up a pool is bad because you've missed the fish. But as I've already alluded to, blowing up a pool means that now you can kind of break it down You can walk up into it, watch what happens if you put your fly in at a different angle, watch what happens if you put your fly in a different spot, watch what happens if you stand in a different location. So if you blow up a pool, take some time and figure out the hydrology of that pool, the dynamics of how that water is moving, how all the different things that you maybe couldn't see from when you were in the back of the pool are being put into play as you literally, maybe with your hand, drop your fly where you think it should go, and then you can watch what happens, of course, taking into account your leader as well as your fly line. But adjusting your angle of your body where you are standing compared to that the presentation spot is a great thing to do if you are having a hard time getting your fly down. All right, so getting your fly down. All right, so the first one is watch an experiment. Second is make sure that you are using the right fly, the right type of fly. Thirdly is your angle or your positioning for your cast. And then fourth is the cast itself. So you might make an absolutely beautiful cast. So you lay it out there and that line unrolls, the leader unrolls, the fly drops down, and everything just looks perfect. Well, that's nice if you are in a casting competition. That's nice if you are wanting the aesthetics of a pretty traditional cast. However, when it comes to a lot of angling situations, that's not going to cut it, because now what's going to happen? The current, assuming that there's any sort of speed to the flow of the current on the top of the water column, is going to start pulling that line, pulling that leader, and no matter what kind of fly you've chosen, and how deliberate you've made that choice, no matter where you've positioned yourself in that pool, everything is going to pull that fly horizontally as it is sinking vertically. And it is probably going to really diminish the effectiveness of even a weighted fly to get down right in that spot. So this is not a big deal if you have a long play before your fly gets to that fish. If you've got 10 yards, then maybe that's okay. Maybe that's not a problem. And in fact, in a situation like that, then it's ideal, because now you're maintaining a nice connection from you to your fly. It is a straight line. There's no belly. There's no squiggles. There's nothing going on between you and your line and your leader and your fly. However, we're addressing a situation where there is an issue trying to get your fly down. So now the solution might be you lose that pretty cast. You allow that fly to kind of pile up underneath your leader. So this can be achieved in a number of ways. This can be achieved in really lowering the application of power, so decreasing that final stroke. So instead of that line and leader and fly unrolling nice and prettily, in a nice pretty manner, then you actually, it kind of starts to die. And so the line might unroll perfectly, but now the leader kind of collapses and the fly is coming down, not at an angle that it was the trajectory that it was moving at when you were making that cast, but it's kind of was left hovering in midair like Wile E. Coyote running off a cliff, and it comes crashing down on top of your leader. Now, this is a dangerous thing because this is how wind knots happen. Wind knots, more often than not, are bad casting knots. But you need to have enough energy and momentum in that cast that you're allowing to collapse so that your fly does either A, still move past that leader that is now kind of collapsing in squiggles and loops on the top of the water, or it is following those things such that it is not going to create a knot on itself as you cast. But this is a really, really good technique because it allows that fly to get down before that current starts to pull the line, leader, and tip it downstream. So again, I think the easiest way to explain this, and as I always say when talking about casting, it's better to watch something. So go watch a video on YouTube about a pile cast would be kind of one form of doing this, but effectively you are decreasing the application of power as you are making your final presentation cast, such that that fly and that leader don't straighten out on the water. They kind of collapse onto themselves. So say you're using a 9-foot leader, your fly is going to be only moving maybe 5 feet out in front of the tip of your fly line, as opposed to that full 9 feet, which would be a nice, pretty cast. So understand those kind of casting tips and tricks. One more I will say is you can cast such that your line and your leader and your fly dogleg out to the right or the left, and this can happen a few different ways. It can be done by either making a little curvature to your rod hand as you are making your presentation, both to the kind of a clockwise or a counterclockwise manner, depending on the angle you want to move at. Or it can also happen if you are casting somewhat sidearm by giving a little extra application of power, or, as I mentioned before, kind of slowing down on the application of power when you're making that cast. So again, that's a lot of stuff that is better illustrated visually than through words, but give that a try as you're making your presentation casts. If you kind of cock your arm to the side and make a sidearm cast, more application of power is going to cause that fly to swing around in front of you, create kind of a hook to the inside of your body. And if you slow that down, it's going to hook to the outside of your body. And the same thing if you're making your presentation cast and you spin your hand a little bit counterclockwise versus clockwise, it's going to cause that line and fly to move accordingly. So go out and play with those things, because they're good. Those are good skills to have. And what those effectively do is they put your fly in a different spot. So if the current is faster, you can get your fly to drop in that fast current, whereas your line and leader are sitting maybe in a slower current. This is really helpful if you're fishing on a stream that drops off quickly. You're able to make casts kind of where your body is positioned in the slower water, and your line and your leader can stay there, whereas your fly cocks off into the deeper water and is able to penetrate the water column a little bit quicker. That's a lot of technique, again, verbalized, which would be much better served if you watched it, but there's plenty of YouTube videos where you can go see that happen. But I'd say go play, just goof around, again, blow up a hole, and then do a lot of experimentation. Lastly, and I'll just say this, is equipment. Easiest thing is split shot. It's going to certainly hinder your casting ability, but it is the best way to get a fly down deeper, faster, without having a fly box full of any and every weight combination. The other thing I would say is to have a sink tip line. The next best thing to that is a poly leader, which is just a section that you can do loop-to-loop connections between your fly line tip and your leader, which is a quick sinking tool. But these are ways that you can kind of, I would say they're last resorts. They're last resorts for a few reasons. One, it requires time, and it oftentimes becomes very hole specific. If you are addressing a situation like we've been talking about this entire 20 minutes of one hole that's really hard to get your fly down into, there's a very good chance that's not going to be the case of the next hole, the next run that you fish. And so to make a significant alteration to your entire rig and your entire setup, especially if it requires pulling apart your whole line, leader, and fly rig, it might be what you need to do. It might be what you want to do. And so more power to you. But I would say it's a last resort, in the sense that if you can change your fly, if you can change your angle, you can change your cast, then those are much more efficient ways to get your fly down. But again, if there's that one fish and you know it's there and you want to completely tailor everything on your person and in your presentation to get to that fish, then that is a totally admirable pursuit. All right. A lot of information. I thought this was going to be a short episode of the podcast, but it kind of turned out to be a longer one. But that's fine, because this is good stuff. And at the end of the day, it really starts with that watching and experimenting. Seeing how flies and water and riverbanks and fish all play with one another is such an important part of not just finding fish, but getting your fly in front of them. If there's something that you think is an essential addition to this topic, let me know. Matthew@castingacross.com. We're coming up on another accusations podcast, which is questions, comments, and the occasional accusation about something I've said or written or filmed. So let me know if something here can be addressed. This week on the website, this is the podcast, you're listening to that. So on the website, Fly Fishing as Labor and Rest. So it was Labor Day, and I know Labor Day has a history, but I think it's also an opportunity for us to reflect on our own work, our own labors. And so this article talks about kind of how fly fishing is a perfect example about how we should love to work and rest, and how sometimes those things come together. I think work has a really bad rap in our contemporary culture. And so this article talks about how fly fishing is work, but it's also rest, and how maybe that can permeate the way you think about other things in your life. Wednesday's article was called Fishing's Most Influential Work at Your Fingertips. So this is another video, and here I don't have a physical book in my hands in the video, but I show you something on my laptop screen, the very same laptop in which I'm recording this podcast right now. And it's Isaac Walton's The Complete Angler, or The Contemplative Man's Recreation. So if you haven't read it, then that's okay. I haven't read the whole thing either, but it's worth diving into here and there and getting a little bit of information. So definitely check that out. I give links in that article to a transcript of the first edition and a scan of the 1676 edition, which includes the fly fishing stuff from Charles Cotton. So definitely go and check those out. This week's recommendation on the podcast is the newest issue of Dark Skies Fly Fishing. Dark Skies Fly Fishing is a primarily online magazine, but there's also print copies. And for the second issue in the row, I have an article in it. This month's article is on New Hampshire's Wild White Mountains. And so I am the kind of the faraway destination contributor once again. So I would say definitely check this out. There's a lot more than just my article in here. There's articles about muskie for fishing the East Coast, for looking for big fish in the tributaries of the Great Lakes, notes on conservation, on Euro-nymphing. I could just keep going on and on and on. And it's a great little magazine. So if you go to the show notes for this podcast's episode over on castingacross.com, there will be a link there for a sample of the first part of the magazine. And then you can, from there, you can subscribe and get all of that yourself. So let me know if you have read Dark Skies Fly Fishing. I'd love to hear from you. Thanks for listening to the Casting Across Fly Fishing podcast. Please subscribe to your favorite podcast app and rate the podcast on Apple Podcast and Spotify. Then head over to castingacross.com for 3 posts a week on the people, places, and things that go into the pursuit of fish.